I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Welcome to another special edition, the epic conclusion, part 2 of our conversation with Christopher C. Smith, Mormon historian who specializes and wrote his doctoral dissertation on Mormon-Native relations in the Utah era. What we're going to talk about today, this is, part 2 of this two-part series. We're going to focus heavily on early Mormon emissaries to Native Americans. We really dive into how Mormon-Native relationships were explored and then leveraged in order to hasten the Mormon theodemocracy with dictatorial prophecies of war, vexation, and bloodshed. Chris, he kind of begins off with reading a letter from James Arlington Bennett that absolutely minces no words about the impending Mormon military campaign. And then we talk about Joseph Smith being on the constant hunt to find a new location where the Mormons could settle and live as a sovereign nation, a sovereign theocracy, Mormon Zion. And then he talks about each of these scouting missionaries thinking that their mission, wherever Joseph sent them, is the most important mission, and how many balls that Joseph Smith had up in the air at any given time. Then we bring it all back to Alpheus Cutler that was introduced in part 1 of this discussion. And then we spend a fair amount of the interview discussing Mormon and Native relationships in Utah under bloody Brigham Young. And, we even tap into a little bit about the slave trade that was going on at the time. And a fair amount of the discussion after we get into the Utah era surrounds Walkara, who was somebody that was quite a formidable force to control Native tribes in the territory of Utah. So today's discussion is a really interesting and fascinating conversation. And as I said last week, I made a mistake with the audio when I was recording it. I'm sorry about the audio quality. It is definitely substandard from how we do things on this show here, and I'm constantly kicking myself for it. So hopefully you can struggle through listening to it. And, once again, Brian and I have both done our best to try and level it out and try and boost and make it listenable. But you're going to hear various artifacts, and it's just one of those things that you make mistakes podcasting from time to time, and you just got to deal with the consequences. So I'm very sorry about that. But without further ado, let's get into part 2 of the conversation with historian Christopher C. Smith. And we're back with Dr. Smith, with Christopher C. Smith here to continue discussing these theocratic inclinations and motivations of Joseph Smith, of the Council of 50, and how this really played out. Part 1, if you haven't heard that, go back and listen to last week, because we discussed some of the important figures that kind of play into this narrative and into this army building. And we're going to spend most of today just discussing how this actually played out, and how Joseph Smith's plans were finally realized by one of his primary successors, Brigham Young. So let's recap a little bit of what we discussed. Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon to Christianize the Native Americans, and he wanted to overthrow the American government. He established his Council of 50 in order to be that theocratic government when the United States government was officially overthrown, and he was able to rise to the mantle of power. Do I have that right?
Yeah. Let me just read you a couple more quotes that we didn't talk about last episode. All right. Joseph Smith writes this letter to N.C. Saxton very early on, and says, "The Book of Mormon is a record of the forefathers of our western tribes of Indians. The land of America is a promised land unto them." And he says, "I am prepared to say by the authority of Jesus Christ that not many years will pass away before the United States shall present such a scene of bloodshed as had not a parallel in the history of our nation."
Well, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and there's early accounts of Martin Harris repeating similar kinds of things. That Martin Harris was saying that Joseph had prophesied that the earth the United States would be destroyed within 3 years. So even initially seems to have set some time limits on it.
Wow.
People talk about there's going to be so much blood in the streets that you're going to be wading up to your ankles in blood, So pretty gruesome pictures of what's going to happen. The 1832 Civil War prophecy, which Mormons sometimes like to tout as an accurate prediction of the Civil War.
South Carolina specifically.
South Carolina, the Civil War is going to start in South Carolina. Goes on to say that it's going to basically lead to the end of the world. And among other things, it says, the remnants, meaning the Indians who are left in the land, will marshal themselves and shall become exceedingly angry and shall vex the Gentiles with a sore vexation.
And vexation is not a cursing.
Vexation
is bloodshed.
Is bloodshed, yes.
Bloodshed. Yeah. Let's also bring into the mix here, because I think this is important as well. Some of the early mission objectives in Missouri specifically was to educate freed slaves, was to teach them how to read by proselytizing to them with the Book of Mormon, which obviously generated a number of conflicts between the Mormons and the Missourians, one of many factors that played into their tensions. So it wasn't just Native Americans who Joseph Smith wanted to cobble together in his theocratic army, but also freed slaves.
Well, I think that there certainly were some black converts, Black Pete being a famous one. Yeah. The black converts don't get treated super well. There's an editorial in the Mormon newspaper in which they sort of they seemed to invite free blacks to settle among them. And the Missourians freaked out, which is where all of that conflict originated. But then the Mormons retract that and say, no, we never said that. Right. They don't seem to have really made any effort to reach out to African American communities specifically, which they do for, the Indians.
Okay. So I think that's important, that it was possibly an idea to begin with, but being met with such fierce opposition.
I mean, they were Yankees, right?
Right.
So
that was a big part of it as well.
They had a much more sort of liberal view on African Americans than most of the Missourians, who were mostly from the South.
Right. Well, and Missouri itself was a quite controversial state because it was north of the Mason-Dixon line.
Right.
But it was a slave state. It was the northernmost slave state.
Right.
So it was a lot of the heated discussion and debates were happening about whether or not, it should be considered a slave state because it was north.
Yeah.
It was in the northern portion. So I figured that was interesting to also add into the mix, but an idea that seems like it was quickly abandoned.
The Missourians seem to have certainly feared that the Mormons might stir up the slaves against them, right. And that Civil War prophecy, gives some reason to think that maybe Joseph Smith had that in his mind, that would happen. But I don't see any evidence that the Mormons made an effort to make it happen, whereas with Indians, I do see evidence that they tried to make it happen.
And that seems like it's an often quoted line talking about South Carolina and what is known as a Civil War prophecy. That's just sort of forgotten, the last part there about the natives marshaling, the Lamanites marshaling together,
right,
and vexing the Gentiles with sore vexations. Because arguably that's a lot more of an operative phrase in that revelation that actually was acted upon.
Right, yeah.
We should, I think, keep that in focus.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is kind of the focus of these episodes anyway. Okay, so this was in Joseph's mind the whole time that he was, during his ministry career, 14 years, that he was actually planning on doing this.
Oh, yeah, and he repeats these prophecies of the United States is going to be destroyed all the time. And in fact, the Pratt brothers say that the destruction of the United States would include an utter overthrow and desolation of all our cities, forts, and strongholds, an entire annihilation of our race, except such as embrace the covenant and are numbered with Israel. And Orson Pratt declared that if this didn't happen by a certain date, by basically the end of the 19th century, the Book of Mormon would have proved itself false.
Wow. That's interesting.
That's kind of a fun quote.
Lucky to live to see the end of the century.
Right.
Okay, so all of this is in Joseph's mind. These are all in his motivations, his grand plans. But we know that Joseph Smith had a lot of plans, and very few of them actually ever came to fruition.
It's true.
Because he was not a logistics guy. He was a grand plans guy.
He was.
He needed a logistics guy to help him. And in that place is initially where Oliver Cowdery steps in. He has the grand designs of writing this book to Christianize the natives. Oliver Cowdery steps in. It gets written in a few months. Right. Sidney Rigdon comes along after Oliver Cowdery, right? Joseph Smith has grand plans to create a religion. Sidney Rigdon comes along, converts, a couple hundred of his followers to the church and provides a much needed membership injection to get it to that critical mass to begin, snowballing and growing and growing. So Sidney Rigdon was another one of these planner people. Brigham Young comes along in 1832, doesn't necessarily make a name for himself immediately, but he's a business guy. He's a very, very successful business guy. I mean, he owned a tavern in New York for basically his whole life. A number of other taverns and other small businesses. He'd been a carpenter. He was a Brigham of all trades. But he was also an incessant ledger book watcher. He spent all of his days counting, bean counting. So it took somebody who had knowledge of logistics to actually put into action Joseph's grand plans. And when Brigham Young comes along as the primary successor, he was able to do that. He was able to move the Mormons to and build their theocracy, and he died one of the wealthiest people in America at the time.
Yeah.
Right.
And Joseph has Samson Avard to organize his Danite organization in Missouri.
Yes, that's right.
He's got John C. Bennett to build his city in Nauvoo.
Yeah.
He's got all these really capable men that he surrounds himself with, often themselves sociopaths.
Like breeds like.
It does. They seem to be attracted to each other, yes.
Yeah. So it's important to recognize that, like, Joseph Smith is the ideas guy.
Right.
He has to attach himself or have people hitch themselves to his wagon in order to actually put all of these things into motion. But one of these things that he does do is form the Council of 50, and we discussed it a little bit in the previous episode. But it was essentially created as this theocracy, the governing power of this theocracy, at the same time that Joseph Smith begins running for president. And part of the Council of 50 was also to electioneer, to send out people into different states to talk about Joseph Smith for president and Sidney Rigdon as vice president. Sidney Rigdon, of course, postures himself in Pittsburgh because that's where he is from, and they need Pittsburgh votes. So all of these plans are actually beginning to come to fruition, largely because Joseph Smith is surrounded by a lot of really smart people. And the Council of 50 is formed. Let's walk through that a little bit prior to his death and what Joseph Smith maybe was using as part of his campaign platform to maybe conceal his ideas, but to also kind of to move forward his grand plans. Right. If somebody's running for president, obviously they have some pretty grand plans.
That's true. That's true.
And it seems also in his presidential pamphlet, he invokes a lot of buzzwords of the day without really taking any hardline stances, so that he may not be too divisive of a candidate. Maybe once he had it in his mind, once he gets elected, that's when he can really begin his great plans. And hey, if you got your own army, it's really helpful if you just, then take control of the entire American army, right? Because then you can do all sorts of cool stuff.
Yeah.
So, so kind of threw a lot out there. Where do we kind of go from there?
Well, it's important to realize, first of all, that W.W. Phelps wrote Joseph Smith's political platform, and Joseph basically just rubber stamped it. Okay. So this is not necessarily even particularly reflective of what Joseph Smith really thought. There's some cool stuff in the political platform that Joseph Smith ran on, but I don't think that it's really reflective of his plans. It's also kind of interesting, that these missionaries who are going to the Indians are being very coy about what they're saying to them. So they call them, instead of calling them Lamanites even, they call them Cousin Lemuel. Cousin Lemuel says this, right? Cousin Lemuel says that. So they're using this like coded language to talk about their activities. And a lot of that is because the issue of agitation of the Indians has always been something that the U.S. government is worried about. It was part of why they were driven out of Missouri, because the rumor went around that the Mormons had men among the Indians stirring them up, And the Mormons probably did have missionaries among the Indians across the river when they were in Missouri. The Potawatomis were right across the river in Kansas, from Daviess County, Caldwell County. Right. But we don't have documentation of that, except that the rumor was going around in the Missouri newspapers. Okay. So we don't know the nature of that mission, if there was one.
When I was just putting together the show notes for that episode 147, I just stumbled on the meeting that Joseph had with the Potawatomi chiefs. Do we know more about that beyond just what Wilford Woodruff wrote in his journal from it, or if that was in the broader context of bridging communication between this group of Potawatomis? What do we make from that meeting in 1843?
Yeah, I was going to say, let me put it this way, which meeting, because there were a bunch of them.
Really?
Joseph meets with these guys several times, yeah.
I didn't know. That's very helpful to know.
Yeah. So, Jonathan Dunham and Louis Dena and others are going to the Potawatomis, they're going to the Sauk and Fox, and the first meeting that Joseph Smith has with one of these chieftains is actually with the assimilationist leader Keokuk. Okay. Keokuk was just passing through. He didn't sort of deliberately come to visit Joseph Smith. He was collecting the government annuity. So their treaty with the U.S. government was basically that they had given up their lands in the east and moved into Iowa in order to receive in exchange a regular annual government payment of a certain amount of money, and they called those annuities. And so it was the time of year for the annuity to be delivered. So I'm pretty sure that Keokuk basically was at the river in order to receive the annuity when it came up the river from St. Louis. Okay. And so he just sort of crossed the river to visit Joseph Smith while he was there. They have an exchange. Joseph Smith, according to the Warsaw Signal, which this may be somewhat exaggerated.
Right, because Thomas C. Sharp.
Yeah, Sharp was a bit, of a colorful character. Right. So I'm sure that he I'm sure that he dressed the meeting up. But he says that Joseph Smith gave a sermon in which he sort of described the New Jerusalem and the glorious time that the Indians and the Mormons would have together there. Okay. And then Keokuk got up and said that he had a copy of the Book of Mormon that Joseph had given him many years ago, and that he liked it, and it was all cool. But as for the New Jerusalem, it entirely depended whether there would be any government annuities there. Which is a clever line, but it may be Thomas Sharp's line, not Keokuk's line.
Right. That's fair. But still, I think it gets to the sentiment of the natives, in so many respects, they had been pushed off, treated second class, and subjugated. That they were just doing whatever was necessary to survive.
Right.
And I think a lot of people could recognize that. And if that is Thomas Sharp's line, then that seems like the social commentary that he's making at the time of that's the only way that they're able to survive because they've been pushed off of their lands and into these tinier, smaller, shrinking reservations. And B, Joseph Smith never paid his bills.
Right.
So that's a pretty profound line. Okay.
Well, and it's interesting, Keokuk being an assimilationist chief, he was very much invested in maintaining good relations with the U.S. government. Right. It's kind of interesting that the Mormons initially gained their converts from among assimilationist sort of segments of these tribes, right? The citizens and the Christian parties of the Oneida and Iroquois groups. They're getting people who have taken white names and speak English, etc. But the groups that end up being most interested in the Mormon overtures at Nauvoo are the traditionalist parties, the parties that are thinking about making war against the United States potentially,
Take it back.
that have traditionally been allied with the British government, not the American government, and that really are interested in hanging on to the old religion to some extent, not the new religion.
And there could have been a bit of opportunism and usury as well. Like, hey, here's this crazy white guy. He wants to overthrow the government. He wants to use us to do it. But hey, if we can all work together to do that and take back our lands, I mean, I can see a group of people who have been subjugated for decades by this point, for over a century by this point. That could be appealing.
Yeah.
That could be pretty great for them.
Well, there have been comparisons made between Joseph Smith's vision of sort of Indian redemption and white destruction and the visions that native prophets were offering, such as Tenskwatawa, who led rebellion against the U.S. government during the War of 1812, And it's really interesting because some of the people that Joseph Smith was in communication with during this period had been active in the War of 1812 and the 1832 Black Hawk War and fighting the U.S. government.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
So he knew the important people, or at least he was able to send emissaries to the important.
Right. Yeah. And some of the important people came to visit him at Nauvoo and spoke with him directly. That's how interested they were in him.
This was not a pie in the sky idea. This was let's do this.
Yeah, it was. Let me read you kind of a fun quote before we get into the native delegations.
Okay, yeah.
This is from James Arlington Bennett, who was a white politician who was interested in Mormonism. There were rumors that he had been secretly baptized as a Mormon. He was in the Nauvoo Legion. He was certainly interested in Joseph Smith and Joseph Smith's vision of sort of Mormon empire. So he writes a letter to Joseph Smith in which he's basically endorsing the idea of establishing a Mormon colony in the West. Actually, this was a letter to Willard Richards, sorry. Okay. And he says, "The chief success of Mormonism must come by the sword. The right of conquest is allowed by international law to be a good right, and the conquered will always have to shape their faith to the will of the conqueror. A patriarchal government with Joseph at the head would be just the thing. In unity there is power. Nothing could resist such a people. Can you with prophetic eye view the millions flocking to his standard from all the nations of the earth? Can you get hold of California or Texas? Or when will you be able to conquer the imbecile sons of Mexico? I would abandon all I have here tomorrow if I saw the way clear for an independent empire in the West. This is my ruling passion. Take your place among the nations of the earth and command respect and obedience."
Okay. I got to pause there because the letters that John Bennett printed in his History of the Saints between James Gordon Bennett and James Arlington Bennett, and James Gordon Bennett is quite interesting in this mix as well. James Gordon Bennett is very flippant and tongue-in-cheek about his, him getting the honorary degree from the University of Nauvoo and this position of aide-de-camp or whatever he got. He sounds very tongue-in-cheek, like sarcastic, like, what can't I do now that I have these degrees? And it seems like when he is talking about Arlington Bennett as well, that Arlington Bennett maybe has that perspective as well. And I could just be trying to read between the lines where something doesn't actually exist. But to what extent could that letter to Willard Richards be flippant, of almost sarcasm, almost like, satire of like, a Mormon empire in the West. Yeah, sure. Joseph Smith at the patriarch at the head of this. Sure. Cool. That sounds good. You guys do you. Right, because he didn't even live in Nauvoo, right? he was in New York or something like that. That's how I'm approaching this. That's how I see that letter. How are we supposed to look at that?
It's an interesting question. I've never read it with that lens, so I would have to reread it and see if it could be sarcastic. But I don't think so. I think he was sincere. That's been my reading of it.
That definitely changes the tenor of that quote.
It does. You're right. So I'll have to reevaluate and consider whether that's a possibility. But my reading of James Arlington Bennett has always been that he genuinely was, invested in this kind of imperialistic dream, and he saw Mormonism as a possible avenue to that. And he was kind of in negotiations with the Mormons for a position of power, potentially being Joseph's vice president, or what he really wanted. He didn't want to be vice anything. He wanted to be the leader. And so basically he thought he was willing to sort of help them build their empire in the West if they would make him the king of it, Cool. So, but I think Joseph had already positioned himself to be king. So Bennett was kind of fighting against momentum there, but.
Okay. I think that's a very interesting letter. Very interesting letter. Also, at this time, Joseph. So there was. If we can briefly comment on the context of the legal troubles of Nauvoo, there was a constant fear that the charter would be revoked. They weren't sure how Thomas Ford was going to deal with all of this once he was, took his seat as governor in 1843. Because the Mormons had been able to curry favor with Thomas Carlin, right? Mm-hmm. Carlin was very sympathetic to the Mormon plight and to their refugee status, and was very helpful in helping them establish their kingdom on the Mississippi, as Robert Flanders so aptly titled it. Thomas Ford was a bit of a wild card. The Mormons didn't know what to do about this guy once he got elected. Mm-hmm. But there was a constant threat of dissolution of the Nauvoo Charter, of too many debts overwhelming them, of the Missouri government prevailing and actually arresting Joseph Smith and hanging him for treason, because that's what he deserved, in my opinion. And then discovery of polygamy as well, and all of the drama and scandal that comes along with that. Constant fear of dissension within the ranks of the Laws, of the Foster, of the Higbees, of everybody else, right? So there's constantly threats from within Nauvoo. Joseph Smith was constantly looking for a place that they could go to not be bothered. Mm-hmm. Right. Initially, that's possibly one of the reasons why he went out to independence, was because there was hardly anybody there. Mm-hmm. A few hundred people plus chickens, right? And then they get pushed out to Caldwell County, and there's nothing there. Mm-hmm. That is Mormon County, right? Mm-hmm. They get pushed out of that as a result of Mormon aggression in the 1838 war. They move to Commerce. It's a swampland with 2 buildings on it. And wood buildings, right? Mm. And they eventually build this kingdom on the Mississippi, but it's still so close to other metropolitan areas. It's close to Quincy. It's close, it's 3 days ride from Springfield, and it's in Illinois, which Illinois, as a result of the railroad, as a result of trade, as a result of Chicago growing exponentially faster, it's becoming more and more civilized. The Mormons were constantly looking for a place where they could exercise sovereignty. And that began to manifest itself in Joseph sending out missionaries to Oregon, to California, to Texas, mm-hmm. anywhere beyond the Rockies, mm-hmm. where they thought that they would be safe for a lot longer to build their theocracy in peace. And then when it came time that the government tried to bring them, to rein them in, they would have the critical mass to oppose it, right? Mm-hmm. So let's discuss that a little bit, because I think that's interesting as well and plays into this whole idea, because you can't go settle in the West without being an ally to a lot of natives.
Right.
Brigham Young learned that.
Right. It's kind of interesting when Jonathan Dunham is going among the Potawatomi. He's not just contacting native tribes, he's also looking at the land with an eye to choose sites for settlement. So he's writing in his journal about, this prairie could really support a city,
Oh, wow. Okay.
So at the same time that he's negotiating with these Indians to help them, get their lands back from the United States, he's essentially looking at which lands to take from them. Which is a
little cloak and dagger.
Sad irony. I don't even know if they realized the irony, because they're thinking we're going to go among the Indians and we're going to be friends with them. White
saviors.
Yeah, white saviors. And so we're just going to get along really well. Right. And it's not going to matter that this land is Indian land, because they're going to welcome us with open arms, And this happens all the time in Utah too. Right. The Indian missionaries are always writing in their journals about locations for settlement. Right. So,
well, and let's talk a little bit about Lyman White and all of this too, right? Mm-hmm. So there was a vigorous debate about the annexation of Texas at this time,
right,
and what would culminate in, what resulted in the Mormon battalion marching out there and like building a road and dying of cholera, right? Like there was a vigorous debate about annexation of Texas, and Joseph Smith told, right before he died, Lyman White, you're to go out to Texas to scout out a location, and White did it,
right,
and he built his congregation out there, basically awaiting the next prophet. I mean, he was like not opposed to Brigham Young, but also not part of Brigham Young's movement. He was kind of his own little movement of Mormons, but like he was one of these examples of missionaries who were sent to a specific area to not only scout out locations to settle, but actually did it. Right. He actually settled and built his congregation out there. That's remarkable, in my opinion. That reveals that sometimes these plans actually came to fruition.
Well, I think that Joseph Smith just sort of like floated ideas all the time, right? He didn't really know what he wanted to do, but he had probably like 20 balls in the air just to see what would land, you know. He's constantly throwing spaghetti against the wall. But the individuals who he assigns to each task are thinking that task is the most important one because that's the one that they're investing their lives in, right? So, Lyman White goes to Texas. Alpheus Cutler is going to the Indians in Iowa and Kansas. Samuel Brannan is going to California. All of these people think that their own piece of that mission is the most important one. So after Joseph Smith dies, there's a lot of discussion about fulfilling Joseph's measures. And Brigham Young basically takes the position that, yes, we're going to fulfill all of the projects that Joseph Smith started, and so he allows each of these people to continue working on their own individual projects. But it turns bad when each of these guys, Brigham starts calling these guys to the West, or he's concerned about possible heresy that are arising in each of these missions, or maybe they're not fully acknowledging his authority. Alpheus Cutler basically thinks that he's the head of the church, in the eastern United States, and Brigham Young is saying, no, you're not. And so each of these guys end up spinning off as separate movements just because they think that their mission is really important, and Brigham Young doesn't think it's as important as they do. So the fact that Joseph Smith was floating so many ideas, basically, I think, is the origin of the succession crisis.
That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, all of these things that he had in motion are just sort of spinning off because they're not cohesive. They don't really hang together.
They do in Joseph's mind in the grand plan of building a theocracy, but the logistics of point A to point Z kind of get lost in the mix, right?
Well, I think they hang together these are all possible futures. He's exploring like 10 different possible futures of the movement at the same time, and he doesn't really know which one he's going to settle on. But he plans to settle on just one, but then he dies, and the movement doesn't settle on just one. It pursues all the futures that he had, that he was exploring.
So that definitely complicates the fact that he, designated like upwards of 7 different people to be the rightful successor at different times. That makes it a lot more complex.
Yeah.
And some of them were successful, right? And some of them were, granted, Brigham was president of the Quorum of the Apostles, but many of these people were in similar high-ranking leadership positions. Brigham Young was a colleague, not a leader to them. So it's understandable that they wouldn't want to acknowledge his role as prophet, as president of the church, as he was signing letters by 1845. Right?
Even he doesn't officially acknowledge his role as successor and as president of the church until 1847.
When he gets to Utah.
Right. Yeah. He's basically saying to everyone, I'm just a stand-in, till Joseph III. Yeah, exactly. And I'm not a prophet. He goes so far as to say, I'm not a prophet like Joseph was, So,
but he really he kind of steps into his own.
He absolutely does.
To try and put our mind into Brigham Young, and let's just kind of move the timeline forward a little bit. After Joseph Smith's death, to put our mind into what was going on with Brigham Young, it's also understandable that he was trying to exercise so much control when there was so much chaos that was ruling these disparate factions of the church. Because the more people that he can keep in his control and keep believing that he's just a placeholder until Joseph III comes along, the more people will, amass and be behind him in order to affect these grand plans that Joseph Smith had. That it seems like Brigham Young inherited, right? Like, I don't think most of the things that Brigham Young did were actually his own ideas. They were just the manifestations of Joseph's grand plans that Brigham thought were really great ideas. Mm-hmm. Like, let's go live in a sovereign theocracy, and I'll be the head of all of it. Sure, that sounds great, right? So there's kind of this inter-conflict with Brigham Young. In it seems like he as well wanted Cutler and White and these various other groups to flourish if he could bring them in, if he could rein them in. But then to see them kind of take on their life of their own and not listen to his commands, like Lyman White and like Alpheus Cutler, it's understandable that is a loosening of the iron-fisted grip that he was trying to exercise over the Utah church.
Right.
Right. So it's complex to see the plight of Brigham Young as well.
It is, yeah.
And I'm not sympathetic because I think he was an evil human being. I just want us to understand in context that probably influenced a lot of his decisions.
Yeah. Brigham Young is such an interesting person because I don't think that he started out as like an obnoxious person.
Obnoxious is an interesting word. Okay.
But he certainly becomes one. And I think some of it is just power corrupts, know.
Exactly.
But some of it is his tutelage under Joseph Smith too.
Right.
He certainly becomes the kind of leader that Joseph Smith was,
And Joseph Smith wanted him to be.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like he really comes into his own during the 39 to 41 mission in Europe. Mm-hmm. That's when he's able to exercise his power. He's able to gain converts who are listening to him. Mm-hmm. and looking to him for directions, establishes the immigration fund that works smashingly well. He's able to really come into his own, and I feel like that's when he comes to realize, hey, I can do this. I can do this. I got this.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Council of 50 is formed under Joseph Smith. Mm-hmm. March. Is that right?
I honestly don't know the date off the top of it.
I think it's March of 44. He dies in June, right? So he has a very short stint where he has in his power this Mormon theocracy, the government of the theocracy. It continues under Brigham Young's direction. Mm-hmm. And that's when a lot of these a few of the quotes that you've read, especially from Cutler, that's when these plans really begin to take shape.
Right.
So let's broach that subject a little bit, and especially Alpheus Cutler, because I'm very interested in this.
So I am less of an expert on Cutler than I am on either Joseph Smith or Brigham Young, so I can't give you a ton of detail here. I do know Louis Dana is associated with the Cutlerite movement. He joins the Cutlerite movement. Okay. So, and I think Jonathan Dunham might have eventually if Dunham had remained alive, but Dunham dies in 1845. Basically, the people who are heavily involved in the Indian mission end up with Cutler because they, like he, believe that that's the most important sort of dimension of Joseph Smith's plans, whereas Brigham Young kind of leaves all of that behind when he goes west, But there is a really fun quote that talks about sort of the substance of Cutler's vision, where basically it says he was going to raise an army of Indians. He was going to lead that army of Indians to level Fort Leavenworth. They thought they could level Fort Leavenworth in Missouri within 4 hours with an army of Indians at their backs. Okay. And then they were going to retake the Mormons' lands in Missouri. They were going to redeem Zion with this Indian army.
Because Joe tried to do that with Zion's camp in 34.
Right, yeah. Joseph organized the army of Israel and marched it to Missouri, and
for the express purpose of redeeming Zion.
Right, exactly.
Redeeming Zion. That was the catchphrase.
Exactly.
And Cutler was like, I can do that.
Yeah, well, and the Doctrine and Covenants says that before that generation passes away, they're going to build the temple in Missouri,
right.
Which never happened.
Well,
but
the time was running out.
Yeah, exactly. The time was running out. And so they thought they needed to do this in order to fulfill prophecy.
Wow. Cutler is a very interesting guy. I look forward to really exploring him quite a bit as our timeline progresses, especially in the 45 and 46 when he's, settling in Nebraska and building the Cutlerite faction out there.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like he's quite the militaristic figure, among other things.
Yeah, I think probably mostly just he was militaristic because he thought that was what Joseph Smith had prophesied. I don't think he was necessarily militaristic by nature. I don't sort of get that from him.
Okay.
But
he wasn't a Captain Fear.
Yeah, no. And in fact, once the Indian mission sort of fails in the early 1850s, the Cutlerite movement becomes a lot sort of more subdued.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So then let's also broach into the subject of where a lot of your expertise comes in then, because as stated earlier, you can't move out and build a sovereign theocracy in New Mexico territory that was Utah before 1850 without building some relationships with native tribes.
Yeah.
And it seems like Brigham Young, as the Mormons are settling out there, as thousands of immigrants are funneling in as a result of the Perpetual Immigration Fund, he's kind of caught in this balance of what tribes do we align with? What tribes do we exterminate or kill off? Genocide? How do we deal with all of this, right? While still at the same time trying to keep this vision of aligning with enough natives that when the government comes in 1857 to unseat him as governor, then he's going to have the military power to oppose him, right? How does that conflict kind of manifest itself in the early settlement?
Yeah, so there are a lot of dimensions of this. So you've got to understand, first of all, kind of the context of native life in Utah when the Mormons arrive. The natives in Utah have only had horses for about a generation. Wow. Walkara, who is the most famous Utah chief, he was a chief of the Utes, the Timpanogos Utes, who lived near Utah Lake. He was the first generation horse rider. He sort of describes horses arriving when he's a child, for the first time. Now, the trade in horses and guns was totally bound up with the trade in slaves. So for several centuries in Texas, the natives had taken up the horse and the gun and begun raiding each other and taking prisoners, and particularly women and children, and selling them as slaves to the Spanish in exchange for more horses and guns. So it created an economy where basically you had to either be a predator or a victim, right? Because in order to get horses and guns to defend yourself, you had to take prisoners and sell them as slaves. And if you refused to participate in that economy, you were defenseless and you would be taken as a slave, right? So, this slave trade basically decimates the sort of peaceful aspects of these traditional cultures. Traditionally, these were like fairly matriarchally oriented societies, they become very, very patriarchal very, very quickly, because now it's the male warriors who are running everything, and the female people are just, they're prey for these they're the most valuable slaves. Yes, exactly. They sell for double the price of a man. And that's partly because the Spanish had the idea that Indian men were like hard to control and women were easier to control. But it's also because they were sex objects. I mean, there really was a sexual dimension to this trade.
You can make a lot more slaves with women.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
that also played into the African American slaves,
absolutely,
where women were anywhere from 3 to 5 times the price of male slaves.
Right. Every time I mention this native slave trade in the Southwest to people, they don't realize that there was a native slave trade.
Utah was very friendly to it.
Yeah, most people aren't aware of this. So, but anyway, so this within a lifetime of when the Mormons arrive, this native slave trade has entered Utah. It's decimated these cultures. It's transformed them into incredibly patriarchal cultures. Walkara leads a very successful band of raiders, taking slaves from the Shoshones, from the Paiutes. Shoshones are a horsed group, but the Paiutes are unhorsed. The Sand Pitch Indians in Sanpete Valley are unhorsed. And so these guys are predators. They'll go into New Mexico and California and steal thousands of horses at a time from the ranches and stuff. Yeah, I mean, really impressive exploits, military exploits. But when the Mormons arrive, they basically, Walkara is the most powerful native leader in the area, and the Mormons decide to join him rather than fight him. They realize that
because they were so weak. When the Mormons first got out there, they were so poor, they were so weak. They didn't have crops in the ground. They didn't have provisions to even survive winters. They were in bad shape. They were nowhere near postured to make war with somebody like Walkara.
That's true, but also they see him as useful. I mean,
that's fair as well. It can be both.
You can either negotiate with every group individually and make peace treaties with every group individually, or you can find one strong man who can keep them all in line for you.
Right.
And so Walkara is incredibly useful to them because he has the ability, he already has the power to keep all these groups in line. He's already recognized by them as basically the dictator of the Wasatch Front. And so the Mormons not only work with him, but they give him a lot of money and goods, much like the U.S. government had done, as a part of Indian policy since the beginning of the United States. And they set him up as an even more powerful native leader than he had been before they arrived.
What was there's an evolution of Brigham Young and Walkara's relationship over time, especially as Indian Mormon wars would flare up and die off throughout the early to mid 1850s. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Walkara wants some balance in the relationship. Brigham Young, of course, is coming in and seeing himself as Walkara's father, and he's clearly the superior in the relationship. He's telling missionaries to intermarry with Native women, which is kind of interesting. He thought that was going to be the means by which the Book of Mormon prophecy about the Lamanites turning white and delightsome would be fulfilled. Yeah, right, exactly. And Brigham Young had an interesting theory of racial biology where he thought that it was the male seed that determined the skin color. So he thought that if male missionaries married Native women, they would have white babies.
Bought them as slaves, too.
Yeah, he did that as well, yeah. Although, I mean, there's some justification for that because there was a bargaining tactic that had been used by Utes for hundreds of years with the Spanish, where if whites refused to buy a slave, they'd kill it. Particularly they understood that whites were particularly worried about babies, so they'd kill a baby when a white person refused to buy it, and then from then on, the white person would buy their slaves. So this is a bargaining tactic that gets used on the Mormons fairly quickly and gets used several times. And so Brigham Young pretty quickly makes it policy that the Mormons are going to buy slaves whenever they are offered, And so the Mormons adopt quite a few children. Many of them get raised as the people's own children and are treated fairly well. Others are treated as servants and slaves. So it really depends on the individual as to how these slaves who are purchased get treated. But
confounding question as well in all of this. how does the doctrine of polygamy play into this? Because if you're buying slaves and you're taking to wife these female slaves, you are therefore turning their skin, the skin of their children whiter, therefore fulfilling Book of Mormon prophecy, as well as Doctrine and Covenants 132 of taking multiple wives, right? How does that play into this?
The dynamics are kind of interesting. So let me go back to 1831. Martin Harris was still officially married to his wife, Lucy Harris, but they were estranged. And so he wanted to take another wife, and he asked Joseph Smith for permission, and Joseph Smith gave him permission to take a wife from among the Lamanites. Right. And this may have been, Joseph Smith may have had polygamy in mind as a justification for this. So this may be sort of the first hint of polygamy in Mormon doctrine that's been cited as, the first polygamy revelation.
Right, but that's also a later letter from the 60s.
Yeah, it's certainly a later interpretation of that letter, right? But the idea of marrying Lamanite women is there very early on. Yeah. Again, it's also been cited as the first idea that maybe intermarriage is the route by which Lamanites could be turned white, but that's not in Joseph Smith's original.
It's not stated explicitly.
Yeah, it's not stated there originally. That's, again, a later interpretation. So moving back to the Brigham Young period, Brigham is telling all these missionaries to marry Native women, and the response from the missionaries is basically like, well, we'll marry Native women when you do. They sort of give the leaders an ultimatum to practice what they preach. Right. There's a lot of resistance from these white men. A few people do marry Native women, but the marriages don't last very long. In part because the Native women didn't want to be married to these guys either.
Of course not. Of course not.
Moses Sanders is going to marry this Native woman, and she asks for time to think about it, says also she doesn't like him very much. But the next day, Orson Hyde marries them anyway. So she's been kind of bullied into this, but she runs away within a couple days. So that marriage doesn't last very long, and that's fairly typical. A few of the marriages last a lifetime, but most of them do not. And these marriages all happen pretty much like within the first year of when Brigham Young says this. And then he really softens that order to marry Native women, and it doesn't happen as much from then on. So, it's kind of an abortive attempt to marry Native women. And you also get, I think, some resistance on the part of the missionaries because they've imbibed the Victorian ideals of romantic love. And, one young man says, well, I'll marry a Native woman, but first I want to marry this white girl that I've had a crush on for a long time. And they tell him, no, you can't do that. You've got to marry the Native woman.
Interesting.
So, and then I think a lot of these guys who do stay married to the Native women don't end up marrying white wives later in life because no white wife wants to be a second wife to a Native woman.
Of course not. Of course, because what does that say about her?
Right, yeah. She's a second class to a dark-skinned person. In the age of racism, that's not okay.
Well, and there was even classic or class divides of white women who had darker skin, right? This came as accusations against Andrew Jackson being, country bumpkin because his wife seemed to have darker skin because she would actually work outside. But of course, the most elite of the wives, these politicians and their wives, they never went outside. They stayed indoors all the time. So they had the lightest of the light skin. Mm-hmm. So even within white people, there was a class divide of darker white people and lighter white people, the lighter being the best.
Right.
So to view that through the lens of being a second wife to a Native.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really complex.
Yeah, but anyway, we got off on a little bit of a tangent there. So to bring that around,
still relevant.
To bring it back around to Walkara.
Yeah.
The Mormons only allowed white men to marry Native women. They didn't allow Native men to marry white women. Walkara was not happy with that. And by the way, other leaders weren't either. Washakie was pretty explicit that the white Mormons could only marry Shoshone women if Shoshone men had the same privilege to marry white women.
Right. But Mormons, no.
No. The Mormons were not going to allow that. So Walkara repeatedly asked for a white wife, and he always gets shut down, even though he had accepted Mormon baptism and ordination. So he was, he'd done all the things that had been asked of him. He still was denied a white wife. And so this was a major point of tension with him, and leads to some hostilities. So there's a big war called the Walkara War. It's a bit of a misnomer because it's really more like his brother and some other leaders who were actively engaged in hostility, and he wasn't even in the area for most of it. But he was definitely out on the outs with Brigham Young for a while. And then they make peace, and in 1854, Walkara dies, and there is some question because there were Mormons administering medicine to him as he's on his deathbed. Some question as to whether he was, poisoned.
Whether it was medicine or
right.
anti-medicine.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And some of the natives suspected that he had been poisoned by the Mormons, which I think is a real possibility because the Mormons did use poison. I mean, we have accounts of Mormons fighting Goshutes in Tooele Valley, and William McBride writes to Brigham Young and says, send us a couple pounds of arsenic so that we can give the Indians a little flavor, and then he closes his letter with this little poem that says, don't forget the spade, don't forget the arsenic, don't forget the cyanide,
Cool. Well, and there's a bit of precedent of Mormons using poison. Granted, it's an antagonistic source, but Joseph Jackson's expose talks about if Joseph wants somebody put out of the way, that he says they're a Missourian, he gets one of his wives to go and mix a white powder in their drink, and they become, food for the catfishes. Right?
Yeah.
So there's a bit of precedent.
There's quite a bit of precedent, actually. I mean, in Missouri, there are several sources that say that the Danites discussed poisoning the Missourians' wells, poisoning their corn, actually.
Their corn?
Yeah, their corn. So arsenic, specifically, putting arsenic on their corn. And then in Nauvoo, Brigham Young is supposed to have been poisoned by Joseph Smith and survived. And then Joseph Smith basically said, well, the Lord allowed you to live, and so therefore, you must be okay. Emma Smith is rumored to have tried to poison Joseph Smith. Where is she getting arsenic unless it's in the house?
Yeah, exactly. Or from some apothecary that's there.
Yeah, she clearly knew where to get it and was aware of the possibility of poisoning people.
Right. And that's a whole other issue that we're going to be dealing with very soon, because that's all those accusations come out of November, December 1843. So we'll be getting listeners. We'll get to that very soon. I promise. That's just a little teaser. There's a very likely possibility that it's at least plausible that Walkara was indeed poisoned by Mormon physicians.
There's this wonderful letter from Hosea Stout, who was, kind of one of the chief Mormon thugs involved in enforcing the leader's rule.
He was crucial to the Mormon Reformation period.
Yeah, involved in, several murders. He goes as a missionary to China, and he writes this letter that has all kinds of interesting coded references to like purchasing medicines in China, that I can't help but wonder if he was sent to China to acquire like exotic poisons.
Possibly.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
If you were going to send somebody to China to acquire exotic poisons, Hosea Stout would have been the guy you chose.
Him or Jedi Grant, or Bill Hickman probably wouldn't have gone to China.
I don't think so.
he was a cowboy. Okay, so all of this, to rewind a fair amount, and I think kind of try and tie a little bit of a bow on this, I think it's also important to acknowledge that Brigham Young was constantly torn with what to do about what he might call the Indian issue, right? Of who to align with, who not to, and if they can actually realize Joseph Smith's dreams of using the natives, and I say using because that's the best word I can figure, to overthrow the government, because Brigham Young always thought that would be a possibility, and indeed opposed the government when they tried to unseat him from office of governor in 1857, which led to a lot of tension, that led to the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It led to a lot of controversial things happening in Utah. So how did he kind of, is there anything that he did specifically that you would think that played more so into the narrative of him building the native theocracy, the native army? Or was it more just like he was just kind of operating reactionary and just trying to survive?
Well, he sends a lot of people among the natives, and part of that is just to convert them or to get their land. He tells Bill Hamblin and James S. Brown in 1840 or 1854 to get themselves a squaw apiece, squaw being a kind of a derogatory term for native woman, and marry them and identify themselves with the tribe so that we can get their land and prevent the U.S. government from getting it.
Cool.
Yeah. So part of the goal of intermarriage wasn't just to whiten their skin. It was to, get to have a legal claim on their land, which was something that mountain men did as well.
Right.
So, a lot of it is just kind of standard imperialistic stuff that Brigham Young is doing. But then during the lead up to the Utah War, when the U.S. government is marching an army to Utah, basically to restore order, and make sure that the Mormons obey the orders of the governor, they're escorting the new governor out to Utah. Brigham Young is sending missionaries to the Indians to basically forge an alliance against the U.S. government and to sort of sound them out as to whether they're willing to fight the government alongside the Mormons. And this is pretty explicit. And then, of course, the Mountain Meadows Massacre. There are some Paiutes present as these Mormon thugs are beginning this massacre, and they dress themselves up like Indians and basically blame the whole thing on the Indians.
Which seemed to have stuck for now 170.
Yeah. Even though the Indians mostly bounced once they realized what was happening. And
Well, because they were the first line to run in and charge, and a couple of them died, and they're like, no, we're out of here.
We're out of here, yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
Anyway, so certainly the Mormons had the idea that they were going to basically use the Indians as a weapon against the U.S. government. And this is a constant source of tension between the U.S. government and the Mormons. Each suspects the other side's Indian agents of giving gifts to the Indians in order to win their loyalty in this sort of ongoing military conflict, So constant source of suspicion. Brigham Young writes about the mountain men Jim Bridger and Louis Vasquez at Fort Bridger, trying to stir up Indians against the Mormons all the time too. So he saw this as tit for tat. So, so he's just doing what the white government has already tried to do to him. And
Brigham fighting a war on a lot of fronts, on different fronts.
Yeah, I really think that a lot of the war in Utah conforms to the idea of proxy war. Like we're doing in the Middle East right now with using Syria and Iran. The United States and Russia basically are using Saudi Arabia and Syria and Iran as proxies to fight their own war. So the Mormons and the U.S. government, to some extent, were doing the same thing in Utah, using these non-white people as proxies to fight their own war against white opponents.
And it's all within this larger context of European American imperialism in colonizing areas that were already inhabited.
Yeah,
and the idea of like American Christian superiority and cultural superiority taking over these groups,
right?
And then using them in the Joseph Smithian type of theocracy idea, using them as tools to affect their own designs, their own ideas.
Right. We're too civilized to fight each other, so we're going to send the savages to fight for us.
That's it. That is it.
Yeah.
That is absolutely it.
And, that mindset has not disappeared today.
Right.
But
I think why history is so important, as it instructs us about what's going on today.
Yeah. Well, and you think about the inconsistencies, the ironies of it. Like, here we are constantly preaching to the Indians to stop killing each other, that they need to be at peace with each other, and they need to be at peace with us. And then the moment that the U.S. Army is coming, we're trying to dispatch them, to fight the U.S. government, to fight the U.S. Army.
Or to fight the Brits.
Yeah,
to fight
sure.
whoever we disagree with.
Right. And the Indians recognized the irony. In fact, when Brigham Young's missionaries go to the Indians and say, we want you to fight the U.S. government, they're like, that's not what you've been telling us for years. So they were aware that this was problematic. But the Mormons themselves, I guess, didn't see it.
This has been an enlightening conversation. I have a feeling like we could go for quite a few more hours on this. And as we broach into the Utah years in the coming years of the podcast, I assume that I will be frequently, asking for your help in tracking down sources and in offering context, because that's your specialty. That's what your dissertation was on. All in all, this is, I think, just a very interesting subject of Mormon history. And it's a subject that so often takes a back seat when we want to talk about, treasure digging. And we want to talk about these other issues that seem so simplistic and childish when we look at the broader context of the cost of human life, when we're really talking about what Mormon imperialism looked like, from Joseph Smith's ideas to Brigham Young's realizations of that imperialism. It's a dark and bloody history. And I think the more that we can focus on what seem to be, in my opinion anyway, important issues in Mormon history, the more that we can focus on how do we construct a more holistic narrative of this subject. And because when we construct a more holistic understanding of Mormon history, especially in the Utah context, I think it also reveals Utah plays out as a bit of a microcosm of the broader imperialism that's happening across the nation at the time.
Right.
It's just an isolated and fascinating example of it. And I think that's where really important conversations need to have. Sure, Joseph Smith got arrested. Sure, Joseph Smith had 30 some odd wives. Sure, this is fun. This is fun to talk about. Sure, polygamy is a hot topic, especially in Mormon history circles. Any panels that feature polygamy as an issue seem to have standing room only, whereas it seems like sometimes these issues that actually have true human life as costs.
And still are very relevant today. I mean, nobody's practicing. Well, I guess the fundamentalists are still practicing polygamy today, but Mormons today are not still practicing polygamy, but they are still pretty implicated in American imperialism, as are we all. And so I think this is super relevant today, remains so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Chris, I want to say thank you so much for helping us navigate these issues, and also for sending me down quite a few research rabbit holes that are going to play into the podcast in coming episodes. I also want to say this to you, because on this public forum right here, the last time you were on this show, that was 3.5 years ago. When I listened back to it, I realized that it sounded very disrespectful. It sounded like I was being very disrespectful to you, and I want to issue, because it was a public forum. In this public forum, I want to issue a public apology to you. I think that was very disrespectful and unmerited and uncalled for, and probably rooted in a little bit of jealousy, because I see how prolific and good of a writer you are, and I wish that I could emulate your skills quite a bit more. And I just want you to know that I respect your work, and I really appreciate you taking the time for this today.
Well, thank you. I don't recall you being disrespectful. I do remember a disagreement about how to title the episode, but water under the bridge.
Fair enough. Well, thank you once again.
Yeah, thank you.
And that is going to do it for our conversation with historian Christopher C. Smith. Once again, I want to issue him a huge thanks for coming on and sharing so much information. He put together a lot of quotes and a lot of notes really quickly. It was a total of about 15 hours from when we agreed to do the interview to when we were actually sitting down and talking, and he did the prep work extremely quickly, even while at a Mormon history conference. So Christopher had really put in the time and brought together a fantastic interview. So once again, thank you so much, Christopher. On to a couple of points of business here. I'm recording this ahead of time because I'm currently traveling down to California when you're hearing this in order to move Annie down there for her internship this summer. So that's why, these are interview episodes and not the regular historical scripted timeline episodes. So I don't have new patrons to thank because I'm recording this before we have any new patrons. But what I do want to do is just talk shop a little bit here. Patreon does have the listed goals that we have at certain price points of pledges to support. And I've had all of these Patreon goals throughout time that this show has been listener supported, and we have attained basically every single one of them. The last goal that is listed right now is something that may interest some of you and it may not, but the last goal is for doing live shows. The thing is this is a goal that I put in my mind, and it's a goal that I basically said, hey, okay, so here's the dollar amount. If you guys pledge to support this amount, we're going to do it. But it's also a goal that I personally placed in myself, and therefore I've done it, right? I've done quite a few live shows, both with myself as well as with Marie of My Book of Mormon podcast, my co-host over there. And, we did that recent live show, Joseph Smith's Demise, last summer at Sunstone with Colleen Dietz from the Mormon Happy Hour podcast. So what happens in my mind is I set my mind on a goal, and eventually it comes to fruition. I eventually make whatever sacrifices and work necessary to attain that goal. And that goal has already been met without the Patreon support in order to sort of, support it. So that's my way of saying, regardless of what the Patreon goals are, if I have personal goals, we're going to get there, right? We as, a podcast host and producer and scripter, and we as all of you, the audience, we're going to get to these goals. So what I want to propose to you is a new ultimate patron goal. And the reason why I'm proposing this is because a number of conversations that I had specifically with Christopher Smith that was not on air, we were talking about the Utah era. And he and I were discussing about the proliferation of documents in the Utah era and how much more complex Utah gets than Nauvoo. If any of you have been listening through the backlogs, you know that when we were moving from Missouri into Nauvoo, that I was very intimidated about the amount of documentation and amount of work that is necessary to get through Nauvoo, because it gets so complex and things accelerate exponentially. I mean, if the episodes reveal anything about the historical timeline, right? It took us, 15, 20 episodes to get, 30 episodes to get through the Kirtland and New York era. It took us 10 more episodes after that to get through the Missouri era. We've now since then spent almost 100 episodes on just the Nauvoo era, and that's only 5 years, and we're still not through it. Utah only gets more complex. So the next Patreon goal that I'm going to propose for all of you is essentially hiring a writing staff, hiring somebody who is going to help me research the documentation and get into the Utah era, because it is so complex that no one person can create a historical timeline of the Utah era of Mormonism without some help. There's just more documents than a single set of eyes can read. Right. A great example of this, when I was talking to Christopher Smith, was he was telling me when he was studying, there was, when he was doing his doctoral dissertation, initially he set out for it to be Mormon-Indian relations from 1847 to 1857. And he said the more he looked into it, the more that he studied, he had to constrain his dissertation from 1847 to 1852 instead, cutting off 5 years of the most accelerated and most exciting time of Mormon and Native relations. because it just gets so complex. And he told the story of when he was, studying for his dissertation, and putting together research for this. This is one example of many times that this happened. He stumbled onto a document archive that is some 8,000 pages of a person's journal, a single person's journal. And he knows that there's a lot of crucial information in that set of journals, but that it hasn't been indexed, it hasn't been digitized, and you have to just read it in the person's handwriting from the journals themselves, personally reading them. So it comes to this interplay of like, do you broach that? Do you read through these 8,000 pages to find a couple of nuggets of quotes that you want to include in the research paper? Or do you just say, you know what, that's too much, I'm not going to even touch it with a 10-foot pole, right? This is the constant battle that historians have of the amassed amount of documentation and the trouble with trying to distill it down into a palpable format. That means that I personally, I'm not even a trained historian. I can't do Utah without a little bit of help. And Utah history is going to be the future of this podcast moving forward, right? What I'm talking about here is this is a 20-year podcast plan. So the new patron goal is to hire an outside researcher, an independent Mormon historian who can help us navigate through the Utah years. And if that's a goal that any of you think is worthwhile and will help improve the quality of this podcast, consider going to patreon.com/nakedmormonism and signing up to support the show for as little as $1 an episode. And you gain access to a whole bunch of new content. We just had our newest foray into reading through history, Mormon history books. This is part of the Patreon exclusive package. If you pledge to support, you get these extra edition episodes. We're doing our NAMO book club. We just finished reading through John Bennett's book, History of the Saints. And this last week, we now had our first reading of History of the Late Persecutions Inflicted by the State of Missouri upon the Mormons, which was written by Parley Parker Pratt, P-Cubed, in 1839. It is one of the closest and earliest contemporary accounts that we have of the Missouri-Mormon War, and needless to say, it is quite fascinating. So if you're a patron subscriber, be sure to check your patron exclusive feed, where you're going to get access to those readings along with my commentary in audiobook format. Of course, if you want to get in touch with me, you can do so at nakedmormonism@gmail.com or on social media, Facebook, Twitter, all of the places that you want to find. Just Google Naked Mormonism, you can find me. If you don't pledge to support the show, it helps out a ton if you leave a 5-star review, podcasting app of choice, iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you do download this podcast. But hey, if you're unable to do all of those, you still hit the download button. You're still here. You're still listening to the outro and the announcements afterwards. And for that, I dearly thank you for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved. Oh my goodness gracious grumptions, that's a lot of fun.